Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Luke. And today we're looking at Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 15. It's often been my experience that when I'm giving a sermon or a lecture, that people sometimes pick up on the most minor things in it. It often seems to me that sometimes they miss the whole point of what I'm saying. I think Jesus suffered a bit from that as well. People were very keen to come to him or go and see him do miracles. But actually we know from chapter 4, verse 43, when he'd withdrawn and his disciples were looking for him, he said this, "I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to other towns also, because that is why I was sent." Jesus wasn't about miracles. The miracles serve a purpose, as we'll see as we look at this passage today. But they actually serve a bigger purpose, which is the message of the gospel. In this passage, we come across a man who has leprosy. Leprosy was a very serious condition. It still is in some cases if you don't have treatment. It leads to a dulling of the nerves. It can actually lead to losing a limb or fingers. It's a very unpleasant disease. And the actual description we have of this man in verse 13, in older versions of the Bible, he was full of leprosy. He was terribly, terribly ill. Not only did he have a serious health condition, he was actually considered unclean, so he couldn't worship, and he was an outcast. No one would go near him. But Jesus cares. Verse 13, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean," and immediately the leprosy left him. We actually see Luke's medical side coming out again there. He's not slowly cured of the leprosy. Luke makes the point, this is a miracle. He was immediately healed. Well, what's the result of all this? Jesus asks him to do two things. Verse 14, then Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go and show yourselves to the priest and offer the sacrifice that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." There's two things that Jesus wants him to do. And the first is do what he was supposed to do under the law, go to the priest, get checked out and be sort of certified clean. And the second thing was this, don't tell anyone. Jesus is aware that when people talk about the healings he's done, his whole ministry goes pear-shaped because he can't really preach. People are just turning up to see another miracle. Well, what happens? Eventually the news about him spreads. It gets around very quickly. And it notes that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But we note in verse 16, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. It's interesting that Jesus did that. It's presumably he wants to avoid the crowds. He wants to get to a position again where he can teach the gospel. But what do we understand from this healing? I think one thing we have to understand is that sin corrupts. It gives us a picture, doesn't it, of how sin corrupts us. It's not that the man was a particularly notorious sinner, but there's no doubt that when sin entered the world, so did disease and sickness. We can read about that in Genesis chapter 3. But here's the other thing. Just as Jesus reached out to this man who would have been considered unclean or untouchable under the law, and in a sense he reconciles him again, he brings him, rehabilitates him by the healing and brings him back into society, what does Jesus do when we come to him to have our sin forgiven? Well, he reconciles us, doesn't he, with a holy and pure God. Just as Jesus touches an unclean person, our sin would exclude us from God's presence, but Jesus has done everything to bring us into God's presence. In the letter to the Colossian church, the Apostle Paul writes this in chapter 1, verse 21. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behaviour. Do you note that? It doesn't say we just got a few things wrong. It says that our behaviour would stop us coming anywhere near God's presence. We're actually enemies of God. It's not that we've got nothing for God or nothing against him. We are in opposition to him. But what does Christ's death for us do? Verse 22. But now he, that's Jesus, has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Can you see what's happening there? Because of Jesus' death, we've been reconciled. Everything that's would have kept us from God has been taken. Our evil behaviour has been forgiven. And actually we've been renewed. We are without sin, we're without blemish. You can read about that in 2 Corinthians 5:21. He who was without sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. And we're brought into God's presence. That's what the work of Jesus does. And in a strange way, that's what this is illustrated in this miracle. Thank you so much for listening.